Stop that noise or get out." The words didn't just vibrate in the air, they felt like a physical blow against my chest. I heard the sharp, metallic clatter of my microphone hitting the hardwood floor, a sound that echoed through our living room in Nashville like a gunshot. My father's breathing was heavy and ragged, filled with a frustration I had felt since the day I lost my sight. "I am tired of hearing that caterwauling, Alara," he spat. "You're blind, not a star. You're a liability, not a performer. Accept your reality and stay quiet, or find a new roof to live under." I stood there, my hands still trembling in the air where my microphone had just been, reaching out into the familiar darkness that had been my only companion for 15 years. I couldn't see the disgust on his face, but I could smell the stale coffee on his breath and hear the heavy, approving silence of my mother in the corner. Her silence was always louder than his shouting. To them, I wasn't a daughter with a dream. I was a broken appliance that made too much noise. That was the moment I realized I wasn't just losing my home. I was finally losing the echoes of their cruelty. I felt the cold draft from the open door, the humid Tennessee air creeping in, mocking my hesitation. For years, I had swallowed their insults like medicine. I had accepted their care, which felt more like a prison sentence, while my brother Julian was given every opportunity I was denied. I was relegated to the shadows, told that my voice was a nuisance and my blindness was a burden the family shouldn't have to carry. "Fine," I whispered. My voice was small, but it was the steadiest thing in that room. I felt for my white cane leaning against the hallway table. My fingers brushed the smooth handle, and for the first time it didn't feel like a symbol of what I lacked. It felt like a key. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't need their clothes, and I certainly didn't need their memories. I walked toward the sound of the crickets outside, stepping over the threshold into a world I couldn't see, but one I was finally ready to hear. As the door slammed behind me, the sound final and cold, I realized that the darkness outside was nothing compared to the darkness I was leaving behind. Before I tell you how I went from that lonely sidewalk to having the most viral song in the country, and what happened when my family tried to crawl back into my spotlight, I have a question for you. My name is Alara Vance. I'm 24 years old, and for most of my life I have lived in a world of sounds, textures, and echoes. I lost my sight when I was 9 years old, and from that moment on, my family's perception of me changed forever. In a city like Nashville, where everyone is chasing a melody, I was told my song was over before it even began. My parents didn't see a talented girl. They saw a permanent chore. But before we get into the details of how my life changed overnight and the gift I eventually gave back to the people who abandoned me, tell me, what time is it for you right now and where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see how far these stories travel. Also, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to the channel. It really helps us continue sharing these stories of resilience and justice with everyone who needs to hear them. Growing up in the Vance household meant living in the permanent shadow of my older brother, Julian. Julian was the golden child, the athlete, the one with the bright future. I was the inconvenience. Every doctor's appointment I needed was framed as a sacrifice they were forced to make. My mother would sigh when she had to describe the color of a dress to me, as if her words were being taxed. My father would grow impatient if I didn't move fast enough through the house, but the one thing they truly couldn't stand was my singing. To them, my voice was a reminder that I still had a spark they couldn't control. They wanted me compliant, invisible, and above all, silent. They thought that by breaking my microphone, they could break my spirit. They were wrong. In our house in Nashville, silence wasn't a lack of noise, it was a weapon. I learned very early on that my presence was something to be managed, like a difficult stain on a rug or a leaking faucet that cost too much to fix. While other children were defined by their potential, I was defined by my limitations. My parents, David and Martha, didn't see a daughter when they looked at me. They saw a permanent medical bill. Growing up in the shadow of my older brother Julian was like living in a room where all the oxygen was being sucked out by someone else's lungs. Julian was the quintessential American success story in the making. He was the star quarterback of his high school team, the boy with the $1 million smile, and the one whose every minor achievement was celebrated like a national holiday. If Julian so much as passed a math quiz, we had a celebratory steak dinner. If I won a local Braille reading competition, my mother would pat my hand and say, "That's nice, honey, but don't get your hopes up. The real world doesn't have many openings for people like you." The family wall in our hallway was a gallery of Julian's life. I knew every frame by heart, even if I couldn't see them. I had felt the edges of the frames with my fingertips, his football trophies, his prom photos, his graduation from Vanderbilt. There wasn't a single photo of me. My mother once told a neighbor that it was too painful to take professional photos of Alara because it reminded them of what was lost. I wasn't a person to them. I was a tragedy they were forced to host. I remember my 16th birthday with a clarity that still stings. Julian had just been scouted by a college recruiter, and the house was buzzing with excitement. My parents bought him a second-hand SUV so he could drive himself to success. For my birthday, I was given a sweater that was 2 sizes too big and a pack of scented candles. When I asked if I could take voice lessons, something I had been begging for since I was 10, my father laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, which almost made it worse. It was a pitying, dismissive sound. "Ilara," he had said, leaning back in his chair, the smell of his expensive bourbon filling the space between us. "Singing is for people who can command a stage. You can't even find the stage without that stick of yours. Let's focus on things that are practical. Maybe you can learn to answer phones at the clinic. Something quiet. Something where you won't be in the way." That was their favorite phrase. In the way. Despite their discouragement, music became my secret language. While the rest of the house slept, or while they were out at Julian's games, I would sit in the middle of my room and sing. I didn't need eyes to feel the vibration of a melody in my chest. I didn't need to see an audience to know that when I hit a high note, the darkness around me felt a little less heavy. I saved every penny of the small allowance they gave me, money they probably thought I was spending on snacks, and bought a cheap, used microphone from a pawn shop down the street. I had a friend, a neighbor named Sarah, sneak it into the house for me. To my parents, my blindness was an excuse for my incompetence. To me, it was the reason I heard things others ignored. I heard the hesitation in my mother's voice when she told me she loved me. I heard the resentment in the way my father slammed the cupboard doors after a long day of taking care of me. I was a liability, a drain on their resources, a constant reminder that their perfect life had one glaring flaw. Julian was never asked to help me. In fact, he was encouraged to ignore me. "Don't let Ilara's situation hold you back," my mother would tell him, and he took that advice to heart. He would leave his gym bags in the middle of the hallway for me to trip over, laughing when I stumbled. He would eat the food I had prepared for myself and leave the empty plates for me to find. He was the golden child, and in their version of the story, the golden child never had to apologize to the girl in the dark. I became an expert at making myself small. I learned the exact number of steps from my bed to the kitchen. I learned how to cook without burning myself, how to clean without leaving a trace, and how to exist in a house without disturbing the peace of the people who wished I wasn't there. I was a ghost in my own home, waiting for the day I could finally find a way to let the world hear the voice my own family tried so hard to bury. They thought that by keeping me in the shadows, they were protecting the family's image. They didn't realize that the shadows were where I was building my strength. The humidity in Nashville that July was thick enough to swallow you whole, but inside our house, the air was freezing, not because of the air conditioning, but because of the cold, hard realization that had been settling in my bones for weeks. I had been practicing a song, a soulful, low-tempo ballad I'd written myself, for the Music City Rising competition. It was a local event, but it was my one chance to step out of the hallway shadows and into a light I could feel on my skin, even if I couldn't see it. I had spent months recording my voice on a small, battered digital recorder Sarah had helped me buy. I knew every breath, every sharp intake of air, and every vibration of my vocal cords. I didn't need a mirror to know I was ready. I needed a family that cared. The morning of the auditions, the house was a whirlwind of activity, but none of it was for me. Julian had a regional scrimmage game, and my mother was frantically packing his cooler with sports drinks and protein bars. My father was looking for his lucky cap, shouting from the living room about how our boy was going to dominate the field today. I stood by the kitchen island, my fingers tracing the edge of the granite. "Mom," I said, my voice barely audible over the clatter of Julian's cleats. "The competition is at 2 p.m. today. It's just 3 blocks from the stadium. Could you drop me off on your way?" The silence that followed was heavy. I heard my mother stop zipping the cooler. I heard Julian stop mid-chew of his toast. "Elara, honey," my mother said, her voice dripping with that patronizing sweetness I had grown to loathe. "Julian's game is a big deal. There will be scouts there. We can't be late because you want to go to a talent show?" "It's a professional audition, Mom," I corrected, my grip on the counter tightening. My father walked into the kitchen then. I could hear the heavy thud of his boots. "Enough, Elara. We've talked about this. You're making this day about you again. Do you have any idea how much pressure your brother is under? And you want us to parade you around in front of a crowd so they can pity the blind girl singing about things she'll never see?" The words cut deeper than any physical blow. It wasn't just that they wouldn't help. It was that they truly believed my only value was as an object of pity. "I'm not asking for pity," I said, my voice rising. "I'm asking for 5 minutes of your time. You've given Julian 10 years of every weekend. I'm just asking for 5 minutes." "And I'm telling you no," my father roared. The sound vibrated in my chest. "You are not going to embarrass this family by making a scene at some local dive bar. You have no business being on a stage. You're a liability, Elara. You're someone who needs a handler just to cross the street, and you think you're going to be a star? It's pathetic. It's delusional." I felt the heat rising in my face, a mixture of shame and a new, burning rage. "The only thing pathetic in this room is that you're more afraid of an embarrassment than you are of breaking your daughter's heart." The slap didn't come, but the verbal equivalent did. "If you think you're so independent," my father hissed, his breath close to my face, "then go. Go find your own way there. But if you walk out that door today to chase this nonsense, don't you dare think you're coming back to this house to be taken care of when you fail. You either stay here, stay quiet, and accept that your life is within these walls, or you get out. Choose right now, the music or this roof." My mother didn't say a word. I heard the soft rustle of her dress as she turned back to Julian's cooler. Julian didn't defend me. He just grunted and said, "Dad, we're going to be late for the warm-ups." I didn't say another word. I walked back to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I felt for my white cane, the cool aluminum familiar in my hand. I felt for the digital recorder in my pocket. I didn't need a suitcase. I didn't need their permission. I walked back down the hallway, past the photos of Julian I could never see, and straight to the front door. I could hear them in the driveway, the car doors slamming, the engine of the SUV, the one they bought with money they said they didn't have for my voice lessons, roaring to life. I stepped out onto the porch. The heat hit me instantly, but I didn't flinch. I tapped my cane against the first step. Tap, 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 the sound of my own rhythm. I walked down the driveway, the sound of their car fading into the distance as they drove toward Julian's glory, leaving me in the dust. I wasn't just walking toward an audition. I was walking toward my life. And as the sound of the world, the traffic, the birds, the distant hum of a city that didn't know I existed, rushed in to meet me, I knew I was never going back. The day the music died in that house was the day it finally started playing in my soul. The first night after leaving that house was a symphony of terrifying sounds. Nashville at night isn't just music and neon lights. It's a predatory beast of roaring engines, distant sirens, and the heavy, humid air that feels like it's trying to choke you. I sat on a park bench near Broadway, my white cane collapsed and tucked under my arm, my fingers white-knuckled as I gripped the handle of my digital recorder. I had exactly $42 in my pocket and a voice that my father had called pathetic. In the movies, when a girl leaves home with a dream, there's a montage and an upbeat song. In reality, for a blind girl in a city that only cares about what it can see on a billboard, it was a slow, agonizing crawl through a tunnel of uncertainty. I didn't have a plan. I only had the absence of my family's voices, and for the first few hours, that silence felt heavier than their shouting. I ended up at a women's shelter in East Nashville. It smelled like industrial floor cleaner and old coffee, but the woman at the front desk, Miss Hattie, didn't look at me with pity. I could tell because her voice didn't have that high-pitched, patronizing tilt my mother's always did. She just asked for my name and told me where the bathroom was. That night, lying on a thin mattress in a room filled with the breathing of 30 other women, I realized that for the first time in 24 years, no one was waiting for me to fail. No one was counting my mistakes. I was just a Lara. Finding work was the next hurdle. My parents had always told me that my only option was to be a charity case at some family friend's office. But I had a secret skill they never bothered to notice. I could hear patterns in sounds that others missed. I walked into a small, dusty shop called The Vinyl Record 3 weeks into my journey. The owner, a man named Silas, whose voice sounded like gravel and old whiskey, was struggling with a digital conversion system for some rare blues recordings. "I can't see the screen, Silas," I told him, standing in his cramped back office, "but I can hear the hiss in the third track. It's a 60-cycle hum from a faulty ground wire in the original recording. If you let me use the software, I can isolate the frequency by ear." He let me try. I spent 12 hours a day in that back room, my headphones clamped over my ears, navigating the audio software with a screen reader that whispered commands into my left ear while the music played in my right. Silas paid me under the table at first, then hired me full-time. I wasn't just fixing audio, I was building a fortress. Every dollar I earned went into a separate bank account, one my father didn't even know existed. I remember the feeling of opening that account, the bank teller asking for my emergency contact. I paused, my pen hovering over the paper. I didn't write David Vance. I didn't write Martha Vance. I wrote Silas Thorne. Just like the person in the story who built a binder of evidence to protect themselves from a lying sister, I started building my own archive. I didn't have a black binder, but I had a hard drive. I recorded everything. I recorded my practice sessions, my song ideas, and even the voicemails my mother started leaving when she realized I wasn't coming back to pay the liabilities they claimed I owed. "Alara, stop this drama," one voicemail said. "Your father is stressed. Julian's scholarship is in review. We need you home to help with the house. Don't be selfish." I saved that file under a folder named The Architecture of Absence. They didn't want me. They wanted the version of me that functioned as a household tool. I eventually saved enough to rent a tiny studio apartment above a bakery. It was small, and the smell of yeast and cinnamon was constant, but it was mine. I changed the locks the very first hour I moved in. I didn't give a key to anyone. I spent my nights in that apartment, which I had mapped out to the millimeter. I knew exactly 7 steps from the door to the sink, 12 steps to the corner where I set up my studio, a secondhand laptop, a professional-grade microphone Silas had gifted me, and a set of soundproofing blankets I'd taped to the walls myself. This was my survival. While my brother was probably out at some bar in Nashville using my parents' money to buy drinks for scouts, I was sitting in the dark, pouring my heart into a microphone. I wrote about the colors I remembered from when I was 9. I wrote about the sound of a closing door. I wrote about the golden child who never had to learn how to walk in the dark. I didn't need their permission to be a star. I just needed to be heard. Before we move into the moment when my world truly tilted on its axis and my voice reached millions of people, I want to ask you something. If your family told you that your greatest talent was a nuisance, would you hide it to keep the peace, or would you find your own stage in the dark? Tell me in the comments. And if you're finding strength in Alara's journey, please subscribe. Your support helps us tell stories about people who refuse to stay silent. My survival wasn't a miracle. It was a deliberate, systematic reconstruction of my soul. I wasn't just singing. I was proofing my existence. Every note was a brick, and every lyric was a beam. I was building a life that didn't have a room for the people who left me in the dust. I was learning that being in the way was actually just the first step to being on the way. And as I hit the upload button on my very first track, a song called The Weight of Silence, I didn't do it for fame. I did it because I was finally, for the first time in my life, the owner of my own story. Success didn't come with a fanfare or a parade. It came in the middle of a rainy Tuesday night, whispered through the mechanical voice of my screen reader. I had uploaded my song, The Weight of Silence, to a streaming platform a week earlier, expecting maybe 50 views, most of them probably from Silas and Sarah. I remember sitting in my small studio, the smell of baking bread from the shop downstairs drifting through the floorboards when my laptop began to chime. At first, it was a notification every few minutes. Then it became a constant rhythmic pulse. I navigated to my dashboard, my heart hammering against my ribs. Current views, 112,000, the screen reader announced. I froze. I refreshed the page. Current views, 245,000. By the time the sun began to peek through my single window, the number had hit 1 million. I didn't understand it at first. I was just a girl in a dark room with a secondhand microphone. But then, I started listening to the comments. I had the screen reader play them back to me, and for the first time in my life, the words being directed at me weren't about what I couldn't do. They were about what I made them feel. I've lived in depression for years, and this voice just gave me a reason to breathe, one comment said. Another read, "She sings like she can see into my soul." Who is she? A famous music producer in Los Angeles tweeted the link, calling my voice the most honest thing in modern music. Within 48 hours, the song was everywhere. It was the background track to 1,000 viral videos. It was being played on local Nashville radio stations, the same stations my father used to listen to while telling me to be quiet. By the end of the week, the tracker hit 10 million views. My life, which had been a series of calculated steps in a small apartment, suddenly expanded into a universe I couldn't have imagined. The first royalty check that hit my new bank account was for more money than my father made in an entire year at his firm. It felt like a dream, but the weight of the new laptop I bought, a top-of-the-line machine with the best accessibility software, was very real. I didn't go out and buy a sports car or designer clothes like Julian would have. I did something different. I hired a specialized lawyer to ensure my intellectual property was protected and a financial advisor to help me manage this sudden influx of wealth. I was building a fortress, not a playground. I moved out of the bakery studio and into a secure, high-end apartment complex with a built-in recording studio. For the first time, I had a concierge who knew my name and respected my privacy. I had a space where I could sing at the top of my lungs at 3 a.m., and no one would ever tell me to get out. The world was finally hearing me. They weren't pitying the blind girl. They were admiring the artist. I was no longer a liability. I was a phenomenon. But as the interview requests poured in and my name climbed the charts, I kept my phone on Do Not Disturb. I knew it was only a matter of time before the people who left me on that Nashville sidewalk noticed that the broken appliance they had discarded was now the most valuable thing they knew. I wasn't just Alara Vance, the inconvenience anymore. I was Alara Vance, the voice of 10 million people. And while the world was celebrating my light, I was preparing for the inevitable moment when the shadows of my past would try to claim a share of my sun. "Hello, Ilara." The voice was thin, trembling with a manufactured fragility I had heard 1,000 times before. It was my mother. She hadn't called to congratulate me on the 10 million views or to ask if I was finally eating well in my new life. No, as the patterns in my life suggested, she called because the bill had finally arrived at their door, and they were looking for someone else to pay it. "We need to talk." she whispered, her voice cracking just enough to trigger the guilt they had spent 24 years installing in me. It's about Julian. He's in a very dark place, Ilara. He made a mistake, a big one, and we don't know who else to turn to. Your father is at his limit. We need you. I didn't answer immediately. I sat in my new recording booth, the expensive soundproofing blankets absorbing the silence. For years, I had been the family's automatic solution, the one who swallowed disrespect and covered late fees because I thought being useful meant being loved. But those days were buried under 10 million echoes of my own voice. I agreed to meet them at a small, neutral cafe in downtown Nashville. I didn't go alone. I brought my digital recorder and a folder of transcribed messages. I needed them to see the scoreboard they had built. When I walked in, my white cane tapping a steady, confident rhythm on the tile, I could feel the atmosphere shift. They weren't looking at me with the pity they used to reserve for the blind girl who was in the way. They were looking at me like I was a lottery ticket that had finally been cashed. My father sat stiffly, his hands folded like a man waiting for a business transaction, while Julian hovered in the back. He was wearing a designer hoodie and a watch that probably cost more than my first recording setup, the same kind of luxury they always found money for while telling me they were struggling. Ilara, you look successful, my father started, his voice lacking its usual roar. It was the first time I had heard him sound small. I look like someone who survived the roof you took away, I corrected, sitting down and placing my folder on the table. What do you want, David? My mother flinched at the use of his name. Julian lost his position at the firm, honey, and there's a legal matter, a debt. He was trying to invest, to make a name for himself, but things went wrong. If he doesn't pay it back by Friday, they're going to file charges for misappropriation. It could ruin his entire future. So, I said, leaning back, the coolness of the cafe air hitting my face. You want me to take out a loan? Or just hand over the royalties from the song you called caterwauling and embarrassing? We're family, Julian snapped, his arrogance still bubbling beneath the surface. You have all this money now. What's $50,000 to you? It's my life we're talking about. Do you want to see your brother in jail? It's interesting, I said, opening my folder. When I was 21 and working 2 jobs to pay your phone bills and car insurance while you were at luxury resorts, you didn't call it your life. You called it your right. When Dad yelled at me to get out in the rain because my singing was a nuisance, nobody mentioned family then. I pulled out my digital recorder. I have a file here, I told them. I call it the architecture of absence. Would you like to hear the night you left me on that sidewalk? Or maybe the voicemails where Mom told me I was a liability and an inconvenient burden that the family shouldn't have to carry. My mother started to cry, the quiet, theatrical tears meant to unlock my guilt. We made mistakes, Ilara. We thought we were keeping the peace. We thought you were the strong one, the stable one. Peace built on my exhaustion is not peace, I replied, my voice hard and clear. It was a hostage situation with better manners. You called me strong only when you needed to put more weight on me, but I'm no longer available to be your safety net. I laid out the facts. Julian had been raised to believe love meant rescue, while I had been raised to believe love meant sacrifice. My parents had used my patience as the floor beneath their family fantasy for 24 years, but the floor was gone. I'm not signing anything, I said. My hands didn't shake. I noticed that, and I saw them notice it too. I'm not your cleanup crew anymore. Julian, if you took money that wasn't yours, you need to face the truth. You need legal advice, a repayment plan, and a real job, not my credit. You need to learn that accountability isn't an attack. It's just the reality you've been dodging. My father slammed his hand on the table, the old anger flaring up for a second before dying out. After everything we did for you, we fed you, we gave you a home, and now you'd turn your back on your own blood over money? I didn't create the fire, I said, standing up and reaching for my cane. I just stopped letting you use my life as the water bucket. I walked away from the table, the sound of my cane clicking rhythmically on the floor. I left them with the check for the coffee and the crushing weight of their own choices. As I stepped out into the Nashville sunshine, I felt clean. For the first time in my life, their chaos was no longer my assignment. I didn't feel like I had won a war when I left that cafe. I felt like I had finally resigned from a job I was never meant to have. For 24 years, my role was to be the quiet floor that everyone walked on. But floors don't sing, and they certainly don't have dreams of their own. As I sat in the back of a car heading to my new studio, the Nashville skyline humming with a life I was finally a part of, I realized that the greatest gift I gave my family wasn't my money. It was their own reality. They didn't change overnight, of course. People who are used to living off someone else's light usually scream when the bulb is finally removed. Julian eventually had to sign a repayment agreement with the firm he'd defrauded, a consequence that forced him to take a warehouse job, the kind of practical work my father always suggested for me. My parents had to sell the luxury SUV they'd bought for their golden boy just to keep him out of a courtroom. It wasn't my revenge that did that. It was simply the weight of their own choices finally landing where they belonged. I didn't block them, but I did change. I stopped being the person who answered the phone hoping for love and started being the person who answered only when there was respect. I realized that forgiveness isn't a debt you owe your tormentors just because they share your last name. It's a door you only unlock when you feel safe on the other side. My life now is filled with the things they told me were impossible. I travel, I perform, and I use my success to fund music programs for other kids who are told their disabilities are liabilities. Every time I step onto a stage and feel the heat of the spotlight on my face, I remember the night I stood in the rain on that Nashville sidewalk. I am no longer the blind girl who was in the way. I am the woman who found her own way through the dark. For years, I thought love was proven by how much pain I could survive for them. I was wrong. Love is proven by what we protect, and the first thing I had to protect was myself. I am finally free, not because they apologized, but because I stopped needing their permission to exist. So I want to leave you with one final thought. If you are the person in your family who is always expected to be the bigger person, while everyone else is allowed to be small and cruel, remember this. Peace built on one person's exhaustion is not peace. It is a hostage situation with better manners. You are allowed to put the weight down. You are allowed to be heard. Would you have given in to the family guilt? Or would you have chosen your own freedom like I did? Let me know in the comments. We put a lot of heart into these stories to remind you that your worth is not negotiable. Thank you for watching. And remember, your voice is the only one that truly matters in your own story.